Um, Now that sounds pretty depressing, Guido. Uh, any prognosis, any size? How many of them was he able to give you any kind of deeper information?
Only one. Only
Only
one.
one. Okay.
Big one. It's in kyste, heart. Like a kyste. It's very near the aorta.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Hello, Ian. Ian Reclusado.
I
see
am.
you. Sorry to hear.
Thank you. Same thing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Mr. Gurdjieff said in the final chapter of Tales was that if he could ever develop an organ that made us aware of our own mortality, made us aware of our own death, he would implant that into our species. Because without this awareness of our time span and the limitations of life on this planet, people just don't really want to work. There's no need for them to work. So how is the inner work going? I guess that's quite a shock for you, Guido. Has it interfered with the inner work, with doing the 60 bone exercise, for instance, or the 12 joint exercise, or the breathing, or any of that?
It is beyond imagination. It is something you cannot believe. Something that can kill me is inside me right now.
Yeah.
And there is no point beyond believing that. The imagination, suddenly you can die in a blink of an eye.
Yeah.
That's very strange. I don't know. I don't really believe it. Yes, I think I'm gonna be cured.
Yeah. Well, I'm prepared to do a lot of work with you privately, Guido. Whatever we can do through Zoom, and or Facebook Messenger or whatever, just to try to help you along. Ian, how is your inner work going?
I have been having a hard time of it. I don't know. We talked a little bit about it last week. Same thing has continued. Seems to be I don't know, some kind of resistance.
What do you mean by some kind of resistance? You were doing bone exercises and various things when you woke up in the morning, and
I was doing those. I was listening to your recording of the compilation for a while, and then I started doing it on my own, without the recording, but trying to follow the same or similar format. And then I just stopped. That's what I mean by resistance. Like it's something in me is fighting it. I don't find the time. I also have been, sitting Buddhist meditation for a half hour every day as well. And I've lost that for, I guess, the past week.
I mean, this is very interesting that you're bringing this up, because this is what happens. It's like we think it's a circle, and we end up back in the same spot, and we're not doing anything, but it's really a spiral. And it's got circular properties, so it feels like we're ending up sort of in somewhere we've been before, but we're always hopefully moving upwards. And what you're pointing out as well is just how important it is to have the right energy within ourselves, to be in the right state, to work on ourselves in order to be able to do this inner work. That sometimes we just don't have the energy. Sometimes, the hydrometer, the little whatever smart meter on it has just shut it all down because we don't have what is necessary to really work on ourselves. And this shows the importance of things like the breathing exercise, which allows us to harvest those higher particles, those higher molecules, those higher hydrogens that are found in the atmosphere and is present whenever we breathe, and the conscious breathing. And has there been anything going on in your life, Ian, that has been draining, that may have been causing you to just leak energy?
Yeah, I think one thing that's just occurring to me now as I'm talking to you guys is my finances have been really rough for the past few weeks. I have basically kind of two income streams. I have Airbnb, the hosting I do at the house, and that kind of pays most of the bills. But then I also do some food delivery that's, a couple $100s a week, and that helps pay for incidentals, extra prices, or if I want to go to a workshop or something like that, it's more kind of fun money. And I haven't been able to do the food delivery for quite some time, and that stressed me out. And then about a week ago, I realized that our Airbnb funds were very low. In July, summer's supposed to be our good months. So if we're low in the summer, then that makes me nervous for the rest of the year. And financial worry always saps my energy. When I'm doing well financially, everything else is brighter, and life's great. When it's not, it's not.
Yeah. I mean, money was one of the corns that Mr. Gurdjieff attempted to step on. He said that, in the 1930s, towards the end of it, he said he liked to try and figure out where people's main corns were, which are the bunions on our feet. Back in his day, they would call them corns. And, the shoes were so ill-fitting back then that a lot of people developed bunions. Their shoes were too narrow or whatever. So this was his metaphor, finding people's corns. And the two big ones were sex and money. So you've got some imprint about money and about scarcity and about lack of resources. And this is such a common one in this world. I keep on circling back over that one. And, this has actually been something I've been personally working through in the last few years, just releasing any kind of anxiety around money. Just letting it go. For me, it sits right, I can feel it in my solar plexus when it comes time to pay rent. And I have a very cyclical business. So July and August are my worst months. These are the months that most hypnotherapists take off on vacation. And the other bad month is January, the first month after Christmas. But I did my best January this year that I've ever done. But July and August is just as devastating as ever. But I'm aware of this now. I'm aware of these rhythms. I know that there's sort of a season for making grain, and there's a season for just kind of relaxing a bit. So I'm in that. But for you, I guess, being with the Airbnb, you figure it's summertime. People are wanting to go on holiday. But in Portland, wasn't there some big thing in the news last week about white nationalists and...
Yeah, supposedly that happened yesterday. I didn't hear anything about it other than, on the Facebook feeds. I didn't hear anything locally. What's happened this month is more expenses. Like we've been fairly fully booked, but I'm dealing with my taxes from last year. There's been some other expenses, and the money that we had put away from June is now gone, and we don't have any really put away from July. And June, July, and August is kind of our,
your
make hay while the sun's shining.
Yeah.
So, and then
Yeah.
kind of December, January, February are consistently pretty rough.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping this year to have some money put away to kind of help us through the winter. And it's looking like that's not going to happen.
Okay. I mean, this is sort of, let's call it, financial or economic identification. Where do you feel this in your body emotionally? Do you notice it anywhere?
Definitely, there's a pinching in the solar plexus, kind of a like feeling of closing off, of like getting tight, protecting or suppressing or something. There's like a
Yeah.
can't, gotta be careful, and then also a heaviness and a dropping in sort of my, I don't know, my lower belly or my pelvis, somewhere low.
Yeah.
It's kind of a so there's like a closing off, and then also like an empty, a pulling or a draining or a kind of falling out lower down.
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing in a sense is a form of emotional identification that's attached to, I mean, it's a form of fear. It's a form of anxiety, fear and anxiety over money. And I mean, this is so common, so widespread. For most people, they walk around metaphorically like there are dark clouds above them all the time. And, people are so concerned with economics and economic prosperity and, all of that. I can speak of someone I know very well. I'm not going to mention who they are, just in case anyone I know ever watches this. But they make an incredible salary, and they have as close as you can come to job security. And there's always a part of them that's a little frightened about money. And that comes from their childhood. It comes from their parents. So these things, get passed on through the generations. I know my mother was incredibly anxious about money. My mother would, wash paper towels and dry them so she could use them again. She grew up, her mother was a single mother with 4 children during the Depression in the 1930s. And so, my mother could stretch $1, but the amount of fear and terror that she had in association with money. And this was a bubble that Mr. Gurdjieff was trying to pop with a lot of people. He saw how money had taken such a central prominence in their psyche. And money is really an illusion. It doesn't really exist. It's one of those collective hallucinations that we all tend to agree on. So, one of the things he kept on trying to do was to pop this delusion, this illusion that people had about money, and in particular the Americans. He would talk about, different groups of people, and he said that Americans were in the dollar business, and the dollar is an illusion. So it wasn't like they were in the farming business, or they were in the sheep raising business, or the coal business, or whatever. They were in the dollar business. So it was all, it was one step further from, the reality, or one step further into unreality, when all you do is trade in the dollar business, and your financial derivatives and futures and all of these things that we probably don't understand, that even the people on Wall Street or here in Canada on Bay Street probably don't fully understand. Just trading dollars back and forth, and the little tickers that go on your screen, and seeing all those things. It's rather quite an illusion. Until you get thrown out of your house and you lose your possessions and you get declared bankrupt, and then suddenly it becomes real in a big hurry. But this whole fear, this economic fear, I don't believe that there's an Illuminati. I don't believe that there are, a secret cabal of people operating, creating this kind of financial distress and this financial uncertainty, as a lot of people, seem to think about. But I believe, this financial distress, this financial uncertainty plays in to the hands of certain corporations, certain political parties, certain politicians. They derive a tremendous amount of power from this economic fear that we have. And it's one of the ways that, our society stifles any kind of dissent. It used to be back in my day that when you got a mortgage, that locked you in to the economic model, and you couldn't rock the boat, and you couldn't go and occupy protests and tent cities and stuff like that, and talk about how unfair and unequal the economic system is, and protest and march because you were locked into a mortgage. They've pushed it back now, and I consider this to be horrendous. I consider this to be something that should not exist in terms of student loans. It used to be against God, so to speak, against the Bible, against, injunctions to charge interest. And the reason it was against, the Bible, against God, was that people, would get into debt. And the way they paid back their debt back in those days was they sold themselves into slavery. And sometimes, to pay off a debt, they would have to become someone's slave for 7 years. And the way the system was set up back then, even if you became someone's slave after 7 years, if you were a member of the tribe or a member of the people, you got your freedom given back to you. But at that point, you were destitute. And so you required, some other way to work. And so usury laws, they prevented this. They prevented bondage. They prevented people from having to sell themselves into slavery because it was against, the law, against the Bible to do that. But we developed a mechanism, which are called bankruptcy laws, that allow a person to clear their debt in 5 to 7 years, depending on their political, where they are in the world. If you're in one country, it's 5 years, another country, it's 7 years. But the one debt that you cannot get rid of is student debt. And so the 60s, this was where the big protest movements came out of, the universities, the campuses. So how do we rein those people in? How do we control them? Just make them take on a debt that they have to repay, that they can't declare bankruptcy with. And, it's just, there's something, maleficent. And that was a word Mr. Gurdjieff liked to use a lot. Something maleficent about that law and what it does and how it forces conformity, and it turns us into sheeple, and it forces us to go into the corporate world or to get jobs that are completely unfulfilling and, sort of shut down inside and just try and get by on the surface. So, money's a huge, yeah. Let's just become aware of our breathing. Let's just take a moment and really try to forget about money and the whole dollar business, and just simply become aware of our body, become aware of our breathing. And right now, I'm just thinking of, give us this day our daily bread, in the Lord's Prayer. The whole knowing that the sun's going to rise tomorrow, that there will be things occurring tomorrow. Quite often we allow our anxiety, we allow this negative energy to just deplete us, drain ourselves. So by focusing again on our breathing, by being aware of our breath, by being aware of the importance of our breath in terms of bringing ourselves back into this moment, and using our breath to help us to begin to grow our inner being, to grow that Kesjan body, to grow that astral self, to grow that internal part of ourselves. So just focus on your breathing. And as I've talked about before, try to breathe with all three parts. So our head brain can see, hear, smell, taste. All of those sensations are in our head brain. But our head brain is also capable of thinking in words, which is actually a very lower use of our head brain and a lower energy, but it's capable of thinking in words and pictures. And so the way we harness our head brain is to represent to ourselves in whatever way we can that we are breathing in higher particles, that we are breathing in these higher molecules that are necessary for our evolution and development. So representing however you want to, perhaps imagining breathing in light, or imagining breathing in higher particles or higher elements from the air. Perhaps you can visually imagine this, or you can just imagine it in terms of words. But using the head brain to represent the fact that we are farming the air, farming the atmosphere for these higher molecules, and we are breathing them in to our lungs, breathing them into ourself. That's the head brain, the representation of this fact. And the head brain, we represent the breathing in. So somehow we're breathing in these higher molecules. And then we represent as we breathe out, that we breathe out a gray fog and that something remains. So as we breathe out with our head brain, we imagine something remains inside us. And as we breathe out with our head brain, we imagine breathing out a gray, foggy waste. So breathing in those higher particles, representing, perhaps imagining breathing in luminous particles, luminous forms of energy, however we want to represent this. And then as we breathe out, imagine breathing out, representing to ourself, breathing out this gray, foggy waste, and something remains. Now we are three-brained beings, and this exercise has to be done with all three brains. Our body brain is responsible for the sensorial awareness of ourselves. So being aware of our lungs expanding and contracting, the inflation and deflation of our lungs, that sensory awareness of our lungs embedded in our body, the awareness of our body breathing, is to involve the body brain, the physical brain. So we represent breathing in those molecules, perhaps imagining particles of light, or however we want to, represent this with our head brain, with our body brain, the awareness of breathing, the sensation of breathing. So as we breathe in these particles. As we breathe out, we imagine something remaining within and breathing out a gray, foggy waste. So this physical awareness connected to the physical body. And these are the ones that most people can do, that most people understand. Perhaps they don't have the energy, or they don't have the attention, or they don't have the ability to focus themselves inwardly to do it for a long period of time. Perhaps, imagination happens and thoughts happen and things happen and, the process is interrupted. But this is where, and this is how most people can readily do this exercise. But here, Mr. Gurdjieff's instructions were to breathe in with all three parts. So it also requires the involvement of our feeling brain. And here it's very interesting that, the first conscious shock in the Gurdjieff teachings, the one that we have to do ourselves, involves self-remembering. It involves really being present here as fully as I can in as many different dimensions as I can. So seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, internally sensing, externally sensing, feeling, to be as fully present as I can here in this moment. But the feeling brain, this is part of the second conscious shock. This is something that a lot of people in the Gurdjieff teachings, it's one of the biggest questions. What is the second conscious shock? Because Mr. Gurdjieff didn't really talk about it as much as a lot of people would have liked. But he said that the second conscious shock involves the transformation of feelings. So somehow the transformation and transmutation of our feelings is involved in the second conscious shock. And I'm just going to pull something up that I've shown before, The Alchemy of Human Transformation. So the left is who we are normally, natural man, not natural man, but man as he exists now. The middle one, the first conscious shock, is self-remembering. And the third, the objective state of consciousness, involves the second conscious shock. And Mr. Gurdjieff said that this involves somehow the transformation or transmutation of our emotions. And we can look at this line here that my cursor is going over. On the right-hand side, the state of objective consciousness. We can come up to a specific molecule, So 12, in the octave of air, which is also the octave of emotions. So the So 12, this is that level of the second conscious shock. Mr. Gurdjieff also said it somehow involves Me 12. My assumption is that somehow the emotional content has an effect on the intellectual content, on the impression brain. So it bleeds over. But the next stage is learning to consciously control our emotions. I'm just going to stop that. So breathing in with all three parts requires the head brain. And the head brain can look, listen, smell, taste, or it can represent things either in words or pictures. So here for me, it's the imagination, using the pictorial element of my head brain. Imagine I'm breathing in particles of light, particles of awareness. Imagine I'm breathing in these higher particles. My body brain, the sensation of breathing. And then we come to the feeling brain. And for a lot of people, because of the nature of the octaves and the way they develop, a lot of people do not know how to consciously evoke a positive, higher emotion. A lot of times, people experience emotions along the octave. It goes do, re, mi, and then because it doesn't have the sufficient outside shock to help it progress upwards, it begins to degenerate. And this is one of the reasons we are so much more familiar with the lower emotions of anger, fear, despair. This is why we live in a fear-based economy, a fear-based society. Politicians who frighten us the most tend to get votes from doing that. And there's this whole attempt to make us feel uncertain and fearful. It's one of the dominant, I can't think of a word to explain it, one of the dominant orbits or gravity pulls in our society is this fear. We pick up the newspaper, and the newspaper is all filled with these things that we should be frightened about. We watch television shows, And the prime time, most successful television shows are all designed to provoke our anxiety circuit. So the amygdalaic, hypothalamic, pituitary, adrenal circuit that puts us into the state of fight or flight. All of the cop shows, the murder shows, the police procedurals, the medical shows, the legal shows, they're all designed to get us gripping our armrests and to flood our body with adrenaline and norepinephrine and all of these stress and fear related biochemicals. So our whole not our whole entertainment, but a huge significant part of the entertainment industry is really designed to provoke fear. All of the horror movies, all of the, what we call the blockbuster movies in the summer, they're all action adventure, teeth, not teeth, fingernail chewing fear. And, we look at the economy, we read the business section of the newspaper, and there are always economists and people out there who are willing to say the sky is falling. We're always just, around the corner from the next recession or depression. And there are all these people who are pushing all of these numbers, like the GDP and the the gross national product and the gross domestic product, and, all of these numbers, and putting, this degree of fear into our species, into humans. And so we don't have a lot of experience with the higher emotions. Even our experience of love, for the most part, is somewhat subjective. Not a lot of people know how to experience and evoke objective love. The object of love, they're very well aware of subjective love. The me, and underneath subjective love, there's a certain egocentric tendency. So a lot of relationships, actually, when people, they love each other, but there's this ego underneath it, that allows them to swing out of love very quickly. So love in that state can turn into hate, and I hate my ex, and I can't believe, this is someone you loved, you had children with, you had bought a house with, and now you can't stand them. That's because we don't experience these higher forms of love, these higher emotional elements. So a big part of the next step up in terms of the Gurdjieff work is figuring out how to work on emotions. Figuring out how to breathe in with all three parts. So how to breathe in with your feeling center, how to make sure that a certain feeling or type of feeling or level of feeling is present within our breathing. I forget the man's name. There was a psychologist, and he said approximately 25 years ago, he discovered something accidentally. And his accidental discovery made the front page of the New York Times. And you never make the front page of the New York Times as a psychologist from an experiment and things that you do. And I've talked about this briefly before in other meetings. What he discovered was that 10% of the population smile with their eyes. 90% of the population doesn't, but the 90% of the population that does not smile with the eyes can be taught to smile with the eyes. Some of the things they recommended doing, for instance, was standing in front of a mirror so you can only see your eyes, and getting to smile with your eyes. The 4-minute video that I saw, of him describe his teaching or his discovery, he didn't really go into great detail, but I know that he said that most people smile with two muscles. and they're connected to the cheekbone. And these two muscles are actually called the zygomatic major and zygomatic minor muscles, and they turn our lips up. And he said about 10% of the population, and he didn't name the muscle, maybe in his paper he did, but it's the orbicularis oculi, which means little circle eye muscle. There's this muscle that runs underneath our bones and it runs around our eyes. And this muscle, let me see if I can pull it up. I'm not sure if I can. So the little circle eye muscle is responsible for our squinting. So whenever we squint, for instance, we involve that muscle. I'm just trying to see. I know I've posted it before, but I know whenever I've gone to look for it, it's been difficult for me to find. I've got to. Let me see. Maybe there's another way I can do this. Okay, I don't think so. Somewhere I've got an image, I've got an actual picture of the circular eye muscles. And what this psychologist found was that 10% of the population not only smile with the zygomatic major and minor muscles with their lips, they smile with their eyes.
Oh.
And furthermore, he found that when you smile with your eyes, it's like one of those magical points in the body that, or magical techniques. If you can smile with your eyes in the process of learning to smile with your eyes, you automatically enter into a more joyful state. With the neuro-linguistic programming, with an NLP, I'm an NLP practitioner, but I was certified back in 1989. We taught people to walk down this street with joy and to move the whole body with joy and to dance with joy. And when you're feeling in a negative emotional state, to really get yourself into a positive emotional state through a lot of movement, perhaps walking down the street or dancing or whatever. And what this psychologist found was all you need to do is learn to smile with your eyes. You don't have to do the big theatrics. You don't have to do all of the work to generate that emotion. You just have to use the little circle eye muscle. Let me see if I can, maybe if I do eye muscle, I might be able to. No, that doesn't seem to work. So try to smile with your eyes. Okay, that doesn't work. I know I've got it, and I know it's somewhere in August that I've actually posted it before, but I just can't seem to find it. At any rate, I can't show you you know what, it's this muscle. Learning to smile with this muscle. So when we breathe with all three centers, this doesn't mean breathing like we're sucking lemons. Well, I'm involving my feeling center because it's depressed. You know, I'm feeling that we've got to somehow engender a higher feeling. Quite often, you know, throughout this process of, you know, discussing the Gurdjieff teachings on Facebook, you know, in meetings, certain things like this online, you know, it makes me go back to my past and really reverse engineer things. the very first time I was taught to self-remember. It was Professor Christopher Holmes, the Behavioral Science Building, Department of Psychology at York University here in Toronto, January 5th, 1981, first day of classes. He said, you know, become aware of what you can see. And while remaining aware of what you can see, become aware of what you can hear. And while remaining aware of what you can hear, become aware of what you can smell. And while remaining aware of what you can smell, become aware of what you can taste. And while remaining aware of what you can see, hear, smell, taste, become aware of your body. Become aware of your whole body, the touch of clothing on your body, the skin where the air touches your face. While remaining aware of what you can see, hear, smell, taste, and the sensation of your body, he then told the whole class to become aware of their lungs and try and imagine breathing in. I don't think he used this word, but it's a word that I used over the years. Try and imagine breathing in a dollop of joy. And when I did this back in 1981, and I can go back and access that memory, I did it with smiling. I did it with my eyes. And it was like I was imagining breathing in this dollop of joy. And I now realize how close that was, that breathing in that dollop of joy was to Mr. Gurdjieff's breathing exercise. So to involve all three brains, to represent it with our head brain, words and pictures, images, light perhaps, particles in the air, to sense it with our body brain, and then to imagine breathing in, as we're breathing in the particles of light, to bring that smile to our face, to bring that emotion into this process. And my intuition tells me that breathing with this feeling of delight, with this smile perhaps on our face, breathing in with a smile in our eyes is actually one of the secret components to transforming these molecules, to bringing themselves within our, breathing them in and utilizing them. So this is something that we have to learn to practice. We've got to learn to step in to more higher emotional states. And this is not easy. Particularly, you know, as we were talking about with Ian and, you know, the whole, you know, financial pressure, and you look at these figures on your computer or on a statement or whatever, and it automatically, you know, provokes a constriction, it provokes a fear. And this lower emotion, this darker emotion, prevents the emotions from naturally evolving upwards. It's like it gets strangled, it gets constricted. And, you know, while I don't believe that there's an Illuminati, that there's a conspiracy of 20 men or a cabal of people operating and working the world's financial system, I believe that the people who are in charge of the financial system, the economists, the various bankers, the various governors of the various banks around the world and stuff like that, they don't want us to be blissful. They don't want us to be happy. The way we are kept in these lower states is through our emotion. It's through our fear. It's through our anxiety. There's a wonderful video that I watched a number of years ago where there's this person talking about the different ways of analyzing certain illnesses in society. And for instance, he says that in every day we have approximately 50,000 self-talks. What did that person do? 50,000 of them. All of those self-talks And think about that, 50,000 self-talks. And of those 50,000, we're aware of about 4.5 to 5,500. So most of the self-talks that go on, and Mr. Gurdjieff would call these automatisms and associations that go on, they just go on in the background from when we wake up to when we go to sleep. But they've determined that when we examine these self-talks, for a healthy, normal, balanced person, there should be 1 negative self-talk to 7 positive self-talks. That's a normal, natural, healthy person. Someone who is suffering from borderline personality disorder, which is one of the most severe forms of mental illness, they have 7 negative self-talks to 1 positive self-talk. And he said that in our society, the average member of our society, Western society, has 4 negative self-talks to 4 positive. And he says that 4 to 4 is the definition of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So what he claims is that we are living in a society that creates and keeps us in this state of PTSD, in this state where we're kind of broken at an emotional level, where we are not functioning properly, we're not functioning at the highest levels that we can. I deal with a lot of clients with anxiety. One of the big problems with the anxiety is that it takes over a person's life. But anxiety is very physiologically based. Normally, the way it starts with most people, we have these pictures in our mind, and these pictures in our mind provoke a fear response from our amygdala. So it could be that the B&B is not quite performing the way it should in the summer, and there's a picture in the mind that you see, there's a way that you represent it. And this then triggers the amygdala, which then sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which sends a signal to the pituitary, which floods the body with something called ACTH, that's adrenal cortisol tropic hormone, which acts like a key that fits into a lock in our adrenal glands, and it's like it turns on this major fight or flight factory, which is our adrenal glands, which then floods our body with all these negative hormones and biochemicals. And one of the major results of that is that we need the blood to run away from a bear, to run away from danger in our large muscles. So the blood is pulled away from our digestive process. So people who suffer from chronic anxiety often have digestive problems such as irritable bowel syndrome or other digestive properties, because the blood has been pulled away from their stomach into the large muscles so that you can either defeat the bear or run from it. This is a completely inappropriate response when it comes to dealing with, these pictures in our mind, because you can't run away from them. You can't sidestep them. So another aspect of this anxiety response is that not only does the body do this to the blood that's involved in the digestion of the body, we also do not need to think at an abstract level. We do not need higher thoughts. So the neocortex, the most advanced part of the brain, the mammalian part of the brain that we share with mammals on this planet, that higher, there's 3 parts of our brain, and the highest part is the neocortex. And it's responsible for a lot of abstract thinking and associative thinking. and the blood is pulled away from the neocortex, put into the big muscles. This is the basis of exam or test anxiety, where students know the material very well, but as soon as they sit in the examination hall, that anxiety, the panic attack happens, and they can't think. They can't recall all of the information that's there that they could put down in the exam paper if they were sitting in the middle of a field on an afternoon or whatever. But because of the context of the examination hall, it provokes this particular variant of anxiety, and they can't think. A third thing that this anxiety response does to our body is that it turns off our immune system. When you're running from a bear, when your life is threatened, you do not need to have abstract thinking, you do not need to digest food, and you do not need to expend energy on your immune system. You have to get away. Your life is in danger. You've got to flee or fight. But this process has somehow been hacked by modernity, by living in our world. There's this constant sort of undercurrent of anxiety in the world we live in. People are frightened of losing their jobs. They're frightened of government spending too much money. They're frightened of other people coming into the country and taking their jobs. A tremendous amount of fear. And so people are not thinking properly. They're not digesting properly. They are leading very unhealthy lives. And so we live in a world that's not really conducive to this inner work, to what we are trying to do with ourselves. And so we've got to then start looking within ourselves. That's why I asked Ian earlier, where did you notice this particular feeling in your body? To start working with feelings, to begin to harness the feeling brain, to begin to allow the feeling brain to progress beyond in the octave of air, to progress beyond me 48 up into the higher levels of feelings. Mr. Gurdjieff says an octave is either developing or it degenerates. So our feelings would start with Do 192 in the system, and then move up through Ray 96 to Me 48. And without the proper outside shock of the proper valence and everything, it would then begin to degenerate. So it then begins to go back down to 96 to 192. So if we do not work on our feelings, if we do not work on healing this part of ourselves, we will not be able to experience those higher emotional states. And the experience of even just temporarily a higher emotional state is very important when it comes to doing the breathing exercise. To somehow, as we're breathing in, to breathe in, to perhaps smile with our eyes, to smile with our lips, to feel sort of an expansiveness perhaps in our heart or our throat, to open our feeling circuit up to some of the higher emotions as we do the breathing exercise. So breathing in with all three parts. So representing, the higher molecules that we're breathing in, however we want to do that. Being aware of the movement of the sensorial body, the lungs inflating and deflating, and breathing in, perhaps with a smile in our eyes at the same time, as we imagine then breathing out to gray, foggy waste, as we imagine something higher staying within us. And when we think about it from a theoretical perspective, the octave of air, breathing, this is the emotional brain. So these higher particles that we are breathing in, that we then use to facilitate our growth, they become the energy that we need in order to help certain lower alchemical processes happen within ourselves. That when Mr. Gurdjieff said, imagine something stays within you. And his phrase, where it goes, how it goes, it does not matter. That's its business. The fact that we are breathing it in and that we are using our breath must indicate that there is some kind of an emotional ramification to this process, that somehow emotions have to be inextricably linked to this breathing exercise, because breath is the octave of air, is the octave of our emotional expression and the emotions within ourselves. So to properly do this, we've got to breathe with all three parts. And to properly do this, we also have to really begin to look within ourselves. This requires, what Mr. Gurdjieff talked about in terms of self-observation, self-study. It becomes important to begin to study our own emotions. So where did you feel this in your body? Well, you felt it in your stomach, and then down to a lower part. All of our emotions are actually felt in the body. They are not separate from the body, but there are specific feeling circuits, and there's a difference to feeling and sensation in the body, but it's all felt in the body. So to somehow first begin to realize where we are broken. What is the dominant negative emotion that we experience? This is a question that I like to ask people, in terms of their sleeping. When you wake up in the morning, do you wake up into a negative emotion? About 20 years ago, waking up was one of the worst things of my day when I was suffering from extreme depression, because I woke up into such a feeling of darkness, such a feeling of hopelessness, such a feeling of despair. And we can get a taste of our dominant negative emotion, the thing that holds us down, generally first thing in the morning. If you become aware and you start to pay attention as you wake up, you can notice that there quite often is a darkness. And to try and notice where you feel this in your body, to try to attach a name to it. With my clients, I actually like them to attach 3 names. So this feeling that you're feeling in your stomach, this really heavy feeling that seems to be pulling you down, if you were to name it, what name would you give it? Okay, you've given it that name. If you could give it another name, what name would you give it? Okay, 2. If you can give it another name, what name can you give it? Because these emotions are not the names. The names are coming from our head brain. They're coming from the ability of our head brain to create these labels. But these labels give us an indication of what the emotion is. So naming the emotion, becoming aware of the emotional circuit in the body is very important. This is something they go into in much greater detail in NLP, and neuro-linguistic programming. There they start with the belief that, emotions are grounded in the body, but each emotion is a circuit. And I haven't really talked about this that much, but there's a completion of the circuit. So, I feel it in my stomach, then it goes to my head, then it goes down my arms, and then it goes down my legs, and then I feel it in my stomach again, and it goes to my head, and then down my arms, and then down my legs, and then I feel it in my stomach again. And, when you start to discern, you begin to see this emotion that's flowing. And the circuit can either complete itself by going outside in front of the body or behind the body. But sometimes it's enough to just begin. Where do you feel it in the body? Where do you notice it? But I mean, Ian, you might not have been aware, but I said, where did you feel it? Where does it go next? So where does it start? Where does it go next? Where is this circuit flowing? And with an NLP, they've discovered that there are different techniques that you can then begin to work on these emotions. Once you have identified them, once you have named them, once you have figured out the circuit it follows in your body. And their technique is to, if it goes from the stomach to the pelvis to the legs, back to the stomach to the pelvis to the legs, in NLP they say flip it around. Make it move the opposite direction. So if it goes from the stomach to the pelvis to the legs, up to the stomach, you make it go from the stomach to the legs, to the pelvis, to the stomach. You create the opposite circuit. And by doing the opposite circuit, we are dealing with that emotion. We are understanding it to a bit better of a degree. That's within NLP. Mr. Gurdjieff, one of the most important exercises, I haven't really talked about this one. One of the most important exercises that we can do is what he called the nightly review. And this is just imagining that we can see ourselves in our day, preferably from when we woke up all the way through, to follow ourselves through to when we go to sleep. To visually represent, to visually imagine we can see ourselves. Here we're doing something very important. We're putting it into the second person. So by seeing ourselves on a movie screen or on a television or whatever, going through our day, we are actually detaching from ourselves. And to do this with emotions also really helps. When we visualize ourselves going through an extreme emotional disturbance, let's imagine that we wake up and we go outside and we open the mailbox and we open a letter and, it comes from a bank or whatever, and it just affects us. Somehow being able to put it into the second person, to imagine that we can see ourselves in that moment as if on a television screen, allows for some kind of internal detachment. It allows us to separate from the emotion, to separate and digest the emotion in a way that we can't normally do that. And I can come back to the physiology of the body and the way we have developed. The prefrontal cortex, the most important part of the brain for humans, the thing that makes us human, is not responsible. It was not designed to build skyscrapers and space shuttles and to do all of the things that we use it to do. It is directly wired into our amygdala. And the primary function of our prefrontal cortex is to inhibit incorrect emotional responses within ourselves. But for instance, the fear, the anxiety that a lot of people have, it goes way back into childhood. Most of the emotional disturbances and problems that people have with dark negative emotions go back before the age of 8. In my practice, 95% of them go back before the age of 5, 50% before the age of 3, depending on the nature of the emotion. Mr. Gurdjieff said that our emotional center is complete at approximately the age of 8, and we can manipulate elements within it up until around 16, 17, 18. But it's virtually complete by the age of 8. So when we're talking about some of these emotions, we're talking about some very, very, very ancient emotions. Now, the prefrontal cortex, the part that makes us human, the part that's meant to inhibit this emotional incorrect response that we may have, begins to mature when we're around the age of 13, 14, at the start of puberty. And the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until approximately the age of 24. So you can see, you know, when it's fully functional, fully developed, say at the age of 25, and we got broken when we were 5 years old, there's a bit of an incompatibility. And we can actually use through hypnosis, and there are many different ways we can actually go back and heal those childhood experiences by tapping into the power of the prefrontal cortex that we currently now possess. But the prefrontal cortex allows us to step back and to diminish incorrect emotional responses through the power of imagination. So let's say you're walking down a path through the woods to a lake and you're camping, and this big 7-foot blur appears. Now you're actually running before you even realize that you're running from a bear. But within half a second, the higher parts of your mind identifies it as a bear. And so you actually think you're running from a bear, but you started running before that part of your brain identified it as a bear. And in this situation, it's an absolutely correct response, the anxiety, fear response to run. But the next day, you're walking down that same path. And because of the experience you had the day before, you're in a heightened state. And this tinge of fear because, you know, you encountered the bear in that spot. And then suddenly you hear this loud snapping of something in the forest, and full fight or flight panic mode, but nothing comes out of the forest. And so this part takes over. Well, I told my brother about it around the campfire last night. Perhaps he's playing a big joke on. Or maybe it's the dog off in the forest, or maybe it's a deer. And we begin to imagine these other possible explanations for that loud sound. And through using this faculty of imagination, we begin to calm the body down. We begin to push that emotion away. Otherwise, that emotion would just cloud us, and it would inhibit us, and it would prevent us from living fully and doing the things that we have to do. So the imaginative part, being able to tap in to this part, somehow allows the emotional content, not content, but the emotional, not even volume, but just the anxiety that we fear to be turned down, to be relaxed. And so, for instance, visualizing as if you could see yourself on a screen, going out and collecting the mail and opening that one letter, and then imagining that you can see the fear, the whatever on your face, that you can see that expression of the emotion on your face, on your body, the way you looked, visually using your faculty of imagination. We actually digest the emotion. So, you know, going the nightly review, imagine seeing your day unfolding as it unfolded, but yourself in the second person. Going through that exercise will allow you to digest the undigested emotions you may have experienced throughout that day. So, working on the emotions is a fairly complex area, but it's something that's absolutely important in terms of what we have to do. Mr. Gurdjieff didn't talk about this a lot. Fortunately for me, it's one of my specialities, being a hypnotherapist. The subconscious mind is the emotional mind, and I do a lot of work with emotions. And I've done a lot of work inside myself with emotions. I used to suffer from a high level of anxiety right in my stomach. And in some cases, anxiety is a warning light. It's like a warning light on the dashboard of a car that goes off. And it tells us to pay attention to something. But most often it isn't. Most often it's sort of an habitual response that we've learned. And so we will notice that we begin to experience the same cluster of emotions, and that our particular cluster of emotions are different from another person's particular cluster of emotions. Though in our society, we probably all share a common degree of anxiety, that fear. So when we talk about breathing, when we talk about breathing in with all three parts, when we talk about retaining some of the active elements, some of the higher active elements within the air, and then as we breathe out, breathing out a gray, foggy waste, with all three brains, though, breathing in and breathing out, means that, we've got to do a tremendous amount of emotional work on ourselves in order to really fully and completely do this exercise. And this brings us back to one of the important beginnings of the mystical path, which is the process of self-observation. Just the process of beginning to observe ourselves without really trying to change ourselves at the beginning, but to begin to observe these emotional clusters, to begin to observe the triggers that cause certain and different emotional clusters to arise within ourselves, to begin to become more conscious, to bring this higher energy, the energy of World 24, the energy of attention, the energy of mindful awareness into this process, and begin to ask ourselves, where are my feelings trapped? What recursive, repetitive feelings do I experience? Are there any feelings that I experience on a daily basis? What is the dominant feeling that I feel when I wake up in the morning? When I go throughout my day, what do I feel when someone frowns at me? What do I feel when someone smiles at me? To begin to get a sense of our emotional world, and to begin to heal, to begin to digest those emotions. One of the better techniques that I use as well is to visualize the actual scene going forward to the end, and then visualize it going backwards to the beginning, and then visualize it going forward to the end in fast forward, and then fast backwards, and then to do a really fast forward and a really fast backwards. This is what I do with my clients when they're in the hypnosis chair and we're working on an emotion. I like to take them back to the very first time they felt a particular feeling, and then what happened, and then what happened next, and what happened next, and get them to give me step by step by step by step detail of everything that happened in that particular memory, and then to convert it into a detached second person memory so they can see themselves. And I'll often say, see 3-year-old, playing happily on the floor, and then see 3-year-old's brother come into the room, and see 3-year-old's brother walk over to them and steal their toy, and see the change of expression on 3-year-old, and then, to get to the point where they're back to normal again and everything's worked out of the system. And then, forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards. There's some profound healing, particularly emotional release that happens when we focus on events that have a really, really high emotional content, or really, solidified. We've got these emotions that have atrophied within ourselves, and it's like they are these things that take over us, and we've got to somehow dissolve them, to work with them. At any rate, any questions?
I don't know if I don't have quite a full question yet, but something around working with these heavier negative emotions. Experiencing them, watching them, observing them, without trying to change them, and also without trying to reinforce them. Is that
according to J.G. Bennett, one of Mr. Gurdjieff's senior students,
I know Bennett. Yes.
He said that using the Gurdjieffian cosmology. Let me see if I can briefly bring it up, or maybe I can't. I probably can't. Oh yeah, I can. What am I saying? I probably can't. Here it is. I can use the one that I've been working with. Oops. So in this schema, 12. So you can see over on the right side, 12. The between 12 and 24. This gap over here on the right side, where I have this dotted line between world 12 and 24, is where polarities enter. So in the realm of 12, love has no opposite. In the realm of 12, we can talk about sort of a primary emotion that has 3 characteristics. And one characteristic is love, another characteristic is peace, and another characteristic is joy. But we're really describing a single indivisible emotion. But as it moves down into world 24, love then becomes love and anger, peace then becomes peace and fear, and joy then becomes joy and despair. So what this means is that for the lower emotions, there is a polarity involved. Mr. Gurdjieff, to some of his students, said, don't, just try to stop expressing a negative emotion. But to begin to heal a negative emotion, there's another technique, and this is something that he actually also talks about in Tales as a use of hypnosis, is to bring a positive to balance the negative. So when you experience despair, despair does not exist on its own. Despair, because it's lower than world 12, has an opposite. There's a polarity involved. Just because we can't see it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So whenever we feel despair, whenever we feel anxiety, there is a higher, it's not exactly an opposite because they're not on the same level, but there is a polarity, there is an other component to it. So one way to work with these emotions are to experience, when you find yourself in the one, if you can flip over into the other. Years ago, when I woke up with such darkness, I went and bought myself a CD alarm. And then I made a CD with 25 words for joy. And I would do it differently now. I would cut the words down and I would put a bigger space, and I time them every 5 seconds. I would leave about 15 seconds now. But I would lie in bed and it would be my voice waking me up. And, I was in such a state of depression, despair, that, joy was the opposite. And so, blissful, cheerful, effervescent, exuberant, happy, glad. And each of these words has a different feeling, a different emotional content. And I would experience them successively as I listen to myself, because we can experience these emotions. We can recall a moment when we felt an emotion. We can see what we heard, see what we saw, hear what we heard, and really pay attention in that moment to what we were feeling. And we can recall moments of deep love, deep joy, deep peace, and all of that. And I would consciously play with the opposite in the morning. So I would work through these 25 different flavors for joy. And it would take about 5 minutes. And, I did it day after day after day. And after about 6 weeks, I noticed a change. Knowing that, at the subconscious level, all of these emotions exist in the context of a polarity. Mr. Gurdjieff actually says that every satisfaction is balanced with a dissatisfaction, every like with a dislike. And, I used to like tea, I hated coffee. I made myself like coffee. This was quite a few years ago, about 6 years ago, as a work exercise, because I wanted to change a dislike into a like. And now I like coffee too much. It worked. But, they're part of a continuum, and we don't realize that our like of this and our dislike of that are on a continuum, and that there's actually, it's almost like a stick that has two ends and that they're connected. Well, I like this, I don't like that. We don't realize that they're at a deeper, more subconscious level. There is an intimate connection between them. So the same with our emotions. So that feeling, of anxiety that you feel, anxiety is a fear response. So the opposite of anxiety is some kind of peace, some kind of tranquility, some kind of serenity, some kind of placidity, something along that line. And to try to consciously recall moments when you felt peaceful, when you felt serene, when you felt safe, when you felt protected. To work with fear, I used to imagine being in a wheat field, because, in times of war and everything, they would burn all the wheat and, scorch the countryside. So I would imagine being in a really peaceful valley with just this golden corn. And that was sort of my imaginal metaphor for that state of peace. Not sure if that answered your question, or, any other questions before? It's almost noon. And it's a big topic, one I hope to circle back again and again on, because, the next transformation, once we begin to develop the awareness of our body, that we can self-remember, we can be present in this moment. Once we get very good at the first conscious shock, then we've got to work our way towards the second, the emotional transformation. And even if you can't do the full emotional bit with the breathing, to even do partial breathing, the head and the body will do something. It will bring elements in. So this is just, this is at the very, very advanced level and a very advanced understanding of it. Any other quick questions, quick comments?
I'm good.
Okay.
Guido?
Not really.
Not really. Okay, gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Enjoy your day. Hopefully it's beautiful weather. I'm going to a wedding this afternoon somewhere in the country, so that'll be nice for me.
Thank you.
Okay, you take care. Till next week. Bye now.
Bye, Alan. Bye, Guido.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye.